Refinery, one so massive that it would become the largest refinery in Africa. The man behind it was already one of the richest people on the continent. But this wasn't just another investment. Because if this refinery failed, the consequences wouldn't simply be measured in millions of dollars. They could reach into the future of one of Africa's largest economies. And now, years after making that bet, Aliko Dangote is asking investors for billions more. So here's the question. Did Dangote actually win? Or did he build one of the most expensive gambles in African business history? To understand why this story matters, forget the billionaire for a moment. Look at Nigeria. Nigeria is one of Africa's major oil-producing countries. It has enormous crude oil resources. And yet, for years, Nigeria depended heavily on imported refined petroleum products. Think about that. Nigeria could produce crude oil, ship that crude away, have it refined somewhere else, and then import fuel back into the country. It was one of the great contradictions of the Nigerian economy. And inside that contradiction was an enormous business opportunity. If someone could build a refinery large enough, modern enough, and efficient enough, Nigeria could potentially keep more of that value inside the country. That someone was Aliko Dangote. Dangote reportedly considered other enormous investments. But the refinery became his defining gamble. He wasn't simply building another factory. He was trying to change a fundamental part of Nigeria's economy. And there was another problem. Building a refinery is one thing. Feeding it with crude oil and making money from the refined products is another. Because a refinery doesn't create value simply by being enormous. It needs crude. It needs customers. It needs reliable infrastructure. And most importantly, it needs margins. The difference between what you pay for the crude and what you can earn selling the products has to be large enough to justify the billions invested. That is where the story gets really interesting. 535. After years of construction and delays, the refinery finally began commercial operations in January 2024. For the first time, the machine that had consumed billions of dollars was actually producing fuel. Diesel, jet fuel, and eventually gasoline. The question was no longer, can Dangote build it? The question had become, can Dangote make it work? And slowly, the answer began to look more interesting. USA 6. 10. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, Nigeria's seaborne petroleum product exports increased dramatically after the Dangote refinery came online. Reuters reported this week that those exports had increased sevenfold since 2023, with the refinery playing a major role. Think about what that means. Nigeria wasn't simply exporting crude anymore. Its refining capacity was beginning to turn that crude into products that could move into regional and international markets. Fuel could now move in the opposite direction. Instead of crude leaving Nigeria, being transformed somewhere else, and coming back as finished products, Nigeria could increasingly export the finished product itself. That is a major change. And it suggests that Dangote's enormous bet wasn't crazy after all. But there's a problem. 0705. Because this is where the story stops being a billionaire success story and starts becoming a business story. And business stories don't have heroes. They have numbers. The refinery needs crude. Nigeria produces crude. So you'd think the refinery could simply buy Nigerian crude. But it isn't that simple. Reuters reported today that between 30 and 40% of the refinery's crude is currently imported. Why? Because Nigeria's domestic crude supply is constrained by existing financing arrangements and pre-export agreements. And imported crude can come with additional costs. Dollar pricing, shipping, logistics, and all of those costs matter. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. A refinery can be enormous. It can be technologically impressive. It can produce hundreds of thousands of barrels a day. And it can still struggle to generate the returns investors expect. 08. And now, we arrive at the next chapter. Because Dangote isn't stopping at 650,000 barrels a day, the company is planning to expand. The target is around 1.4 million barrels per day within 3 years. And to help fund that expansion, Dangote Refinery is preparing for a potential initial public offering in Nigeria. The target? Approximately $5 billion. If it goes ahead at that scale, it could become the largest IPO in African history. Read that again. The man who already bet roughly $20 billion on the refinery is now preparing to ask public investors for another $5 billion. This is no longer just Dangote's gamble. It could become the market's gamble. A850. And that's why investors are watching closely. They don't care simply that the refinery is huge. They want to know, how much crude can it secure? How much does that crude cost? How efficiently can the refinery operate? How strong are its margins? How much cash can the business generate? And ultimately, how much is the refinery really worth? Those questions are much harder to answer than simply looking at a giant refinery on the horizon. Because buildings don't create wealth. Businesses do. And the difference is enormous. So, did Aliko Dangote win? If winning means taking an almost unimaginable idea and turning it into a functioning refinery, then yes. If winning means creating a new source of refined petroleum products for Nigeria and the wider region, there is already evidence that something significant has happened. But if winning means proving that a roughly $20 billion investment can generate extraordinary returns, we don't know yet. And that's what makes this story so fascinating. The refinery is real. The machines are running. The fuel is being produced. The exports are growing. But the final score hasn't been written. And perhaps that is the most important lesson in the entire Dangote story. We often look at billionaires and assume the fortune was created by one brilliant idea. But that's rarely how it works. Dangote built his empire by repeatedly moving deeper into businesses people depend on. First commodities, then manufacturing, then cement, then increasingly complex industrial businesses, and finally, oil refining. Each step required more capital, more infrastructure, more risk, and more confidence. But the refinery may be his biggest test yet, because when you spend $20 billion building the machine, building it is only half the story. The real question is whether the machine can make the money. And now, Dangote is asking investors to put another $5 billion behind that answer. So perhaps the real question isn't, did Dangote win? Perhaps it's this: what happens if he's only getting started? Because if the refinery reaches its expansion target, if crude supply becomes more reliable, if the economics hold, and if investors believe the business deserves its valuation, then the $20 billion gamble could become something much bigger. Not just a refinery, not just a fortune, but an industrial platform capable of reshaping how energy moves across Africa. And if that happens, we may look back at the refinery not as the moment Dangote took his biggest risk, but as the moment his biggest empire truly began. This story isn't over, and that's exactly why we're watching. End hidden wealth. Every fortune has a story.